Hi, so today we are taking a look at the work in chapter 19, which is variation. So you should already have some sort of idea what variation is just because of your knowledge of the word. Variation is similar things but with specific characteristic differences. So the difference between certain features of individuals such as ourselves are called phenotypic variations. And we use the word phenotype because we all have a genotype inside of us, inside our cells, in our DNA. If you remember from the previous chapter, the phenotype is what we see, it's what's being expressed, the genes that are being expressed. So phenotype, for example, might be the color of my hair, or the color of my skin, or how tall I am. These are all variations. Even though we are all human beings, there are certain variations within the species that make up who we are. Now, there are two types of variations. There's discontinuous variation and continuous variation. So discontinuous variation is like a set category. It's a set sort of specifications, for example. An example of discontinuous variation would be our blood types. For example, if our blood type is blood type O, for example, that is what it is. It can't change. I like to remember it that way, as it's discontinued, like it's set, that's it. It can't continue to change by any means. Now the other one is continuous variation, and a good example for this might be our height. Our height is continuously changing until we reach, say, a certain point where it doesn't seem to change, but it does kind of fluctuate a little bit. And even as we get older, our height, we actually become shorter again because our spine compresses a little bit more. And this is an example of continuous variation. There's no set category here. You can be any height. You don't have to be a certain range of height. A discontinuous variation, there is constraints. You can only be 4 types of blood types. There's no other type of blood types. Those are the 4, and you will be one of those 4. It doesn't matter what. But with continuous variation, there's a lot more possibilities, basically. That's just the way I like to remember it. So when it comes to variation, there are 2 factors that are extremely critical to consider, and these are genetic factors and environmental factors. Now, genetic factors, that's our genes, our genetic makeup, the code that makes us who we are. For example, you might have genes to be a certain height, but if you do not have the correct nutrition, then you will never reach your full potential of your height. Your environment is your surroundings and plays a big role in the small variations that make up who you are. So you might have the genes to be tall, but if your environment doesn't allow that, if you're not in an environment where you can grow, if you don't have any food, if you are living in a poverty-stricken area, you don't have the correct nutrition, your environment won't allow you to grow to your full height potential. So your genes give you this sort of range, but your environment also plays a role in where in that range you will land up. There's another thing that can affect your genetic variation, and this is through mutations. Mutations are basically different pieces or parts of DNA that are inserted into your DNA, and it slightly alters the code. So your DNA will not code for a specific protein, this protein for example, but it will code for another protein, for example, which might change the structure and the function of these proteins that your body will produce. So this is how mutations occur via radiation. If our DNA is exposed to radiation, this radiation actually damages these base pairs. Remember, we've got our guanine, which links up to thymine, and our adenine, which links up to cytosine. So what radiation does is it goes and it damages these bases, and it can either knock them out, or sometimes a different base can take the place of this. And then when the DNA is read, it will code for a different protein, and this different protein will result in a different structure of the protein. So instead of our protein being that shape, for example, now we end up with a protein of that shape, and this will affect the function of the protein. If this protein was going to be part of a membrane, for example, now the protein has this shape, and now if it links up with other proteins, it will result in a whole different structure, and this will affect the function of whatever organelle it is involved in. Now, in another scenario, we might again have our DNA, and now we've got a heavy metal, which, for example, lead over here, and what lead does is it actually interrupts the way that the DNA is being read and coded for. So if a messenger RNA strand comes in to make a complementary copy of this strand of DNA to go to the ribosome and be involved in protein synthesis, normally we would have thymine would link to adenine, and adenine would link to thymine again, but now the lead might interrupt here and cause a defect in this messenger RNA strand, resulting the strand to be either incomplete or something like that, and then this messenger RNA strand will be read differently from what it's intended to be read, and this again will result in a different protein structure being formed than the original one codes for. So if our protein structure was supposed to code for this structure of protein, now our protein all of a sudden codes for this protein. There will be functional changes inside the cell that can either be of benefit to the organism, or it can result in problems. So let's talk about adaptive features. Adaptive features are basically a characteristic or trait that determines how well adapted an organism is to its immediate environment. For example, certain animals have a certain color so that they are camouflaged and can't be seen. This is an example of an adaptive feature. So the better adapted an organism is to its environment, the more likely it is to survive. For example, an animal that is camouflaged in tall grass is more likely to survive because a lion, for example, might not see it as well and won't kill it. So we use the term fitness to describe how well an organism is adapted to its environment and the likelihood of it reproducing. So a zebra who can stand still in a tall grass and the stripes on its body sort of camouflages it so that it breaks up its outline, so the lion can't actually see and hunt this animal and kill it. This zebra has a higher chance of surviving and reproducing offspring with the same characteristics. So the zebra has a high level of fitness. Compare this to a crazy example. If we take a kangaroo and put the kangaroo in Africa, the kangaroo won't be as well adapted. The kangaroo won't have as great adaptive features. It doesn't have any stripes or lines that breaks up an outline in the tall African grass, and the kangaroo will stand out more and the lion will see the animal, hunt it and kill it. Thus the kangaroo won't have a great chance of surviving and reproducing in its environment, and thus it has a low fitness. So there are a crazy amount of adaptive features. The ones listed in your textbook are really important for you to know. Take a look at the stomata, how they open and close. This is a great adaptive feature of plant. The plant can actually control the amount of moisture it loses by closing the stomata, which prevents any moisture inside the leaf from evaporating during very hot, arid conditions. Other plants are very well adapted to the desert. They are able to store water effectively, and they also have very small leaf surface areas that help them to prevent the loss of water. So let's talk about selection. Well, you probably know a little bit of this just because you might be familiar with the term selection. To select means to choose a specific thing or object. Now, in the context that we are discussing selection in, we are talking about certain animals, certain traits, certain characteristics, and certain phenotypes. So selection will apply to all those. So most organisms have a certain amount of variation between certain individuals. For example, one person has blonde hair while the other person has blonde hair, but it's slightly darker, and his eye color is different. That's a typical example of variation. This variations might make some organisms better adapted to their environment than other organisms. For example, in our zebra scenario, we've got zebra with stripes and zebra without stripes. The zebra with stripes is so much better adapted to the African bush because the stripes breaks up its outline and is able to camouflage, where the zebra without stripes can't camouflage, so it's not as well adapted to its environment. So variation comes into play when it comes to the adaptation to environment. Organisms also overproduce. What they mean by that is that certain organisms will produce more than one offspring to ensure the survival of the species. And by doing so, there's more chance that organisms with a specific variation that's adapted to that environment is going to be present in the offspring. If you remember from our previous chapter in genetics, there's a certain percentage chance that a certain gene gets passed on from the parent to the offspring. So by producing more offspring, there's more chance that that gene for the trait that makes an organism better adapted to the environment will be passed on. There's also this idea of struggling for existence, and that is basically exactly what it sounds like. Organisms have to compete with each other for food, for shelter. So the fitter, stronger organisms, the organisms that are better adapted, will be more likely to survive. This ties in with survival of the fittest. Like I said, the fittest organisms will be the organisms that are able to reproduce and carry on their gene line. So only organisms that are well adapted to environments, so only the zebras, for example, with stripes, will be able to reproduce and carry on that genetic line to their offspring, because the zebra without stripes won't be able to survive in that environment. In another environment it might, but in that specific environment it won't survive, and thus we've got zebras with stripes that survive. So all these ideas and concepts over a period of time, they play a very significant role in the change in the natural world. Species that are adapted to certain environments will flourish in those environments specifically, while other species that aren't adapted to those environments might not survive in these environments, but they might survive in a completely different environment. And that is why certain animals are only found in certain parts of the world and not on others. The population that is better adapted, for example the zebra with stripes, is better adapted to the grassland environment, so it will survive in that environment and not in, for example, the polar circle. It won't survive there, and thus any animals that might have been present in that area will die, and any animals that are present in the veld area will definitely survive. This ties in with the process of natural selection. The organisms that survive are basically selected to survive in that environment by their environment, their genes, and all of the factors that we just discussed, and that is natural selection. So Charles Darwin came up with this idea of natural selection, and he basically theorized that organisms that are better adapted, that have the genotypes that result in phenotypes, which are better adapted in certain environments, will be selected, and they will carry on to reproduce more organisms. And the organisms that have genotypes that result in less desirable phenotypes, for example our zebra without stripes, they will perish and they won't carry on in that environment. So an example of this is antibiotic resistant bacteria. When organisms get exposed to antibiotics, most of the organisms die. However, some organisms do not die completely, and they can sort of figure out a way to strengthen their cell walls and protect themselves. Now, if these organisms are left to reproduce, they will pass that gene on to other organisms, resulting in a whole bunch of organisms that are resistant to a specific antibiotic. Now, if this carries on over a period of time, we've got a bacteria that is resistant to a whole bunch of antibiotics, and this is the problem we face today, is so many organisms are resistant to antibiotics because they've been exposed to those antibiotics. So they've been selected through this process of natural selection. They've just got the right mutation, or they've got the right genotype to be resistant to an antibiotic, and when they are allowed to reproduce, we sit with a problem. So lastly, we'll quickly take a look at sickle-cell anemia, and sickle-cell anemia is basically a disorder or disease in which normal hemoglobin, which has a nice round biconcave disc shape, has a change in the protein structure, and the red blood cells actually look like a sickle cell instead of the normal nice round red blood cell. This poses a big problem because these sickle cells can get stuck in capillaries and cause all sorts of issues. Now this disease is quite prevalent, especially in Africa. So if we argue that there's healthy people and people with a certain disease, wouldn't the people with the disease sort of be selected to not reproduce and carry on the genes for that disease, because this is a genetic disease, it's in your DNA code. You can't change the disease in up to date, there's no cure for this disease. The people with sickle cell anemia live in Africa where there's high amounts of mosquitoes carrying malaria. And what's interesting is the people that have the sickle cells are actually resistant to malaria, and the people with the normal cells are affected by malaria. And this is an example of natural selection, where the people that are better adapted to a specific environment are fitter in that environment, and they can reproduce and produce offspring, whereas the people that aren't adapted to the environment, even though they might not have a disease, are more likely to die from malaria, and thus they are less likely to reproduce. So the people that have sickle cell anemia are better adapted to their environment in Africa. Lastly, we quickly take a look at selective breeding. Now this has been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. Farmers all over the world do this. So basically they select any organism, for example cows that produce a lot of milk will be selected to breed with each other, and the cows that don't produce a lot of milk will not be allowed to breed. So this is a sort of artificial way of manipulating this whole process of natural selection. Alright, good luck with the studying and go and get those good marks.